and we pray.
Amen. Thanks, sir. All right. So this is our last class on Ruth. We're going to be studying Ruth chapter 4, and then we'll get you kind of a conclusion at the end of it and go over some of the applications like we've done. So thank you, everyone, again, for all your participation as we went through this class. It's been great. It's made it very, very easy to teach with all the participation. So thank you. So we'll do a quick overview as we have done each week to kind of get us caught up from where we're at and where we left off. All right, so overview of the first 3 chapters that we've done. Elimelech takes his family from Bethlehem to Moab because of a famine in the land. Once they get to Moab, Elimelech dies. Chilion and Mahlon, they marry Ruth and Orpah. They then pass away, leaving Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah as widows. Naomi learns of that the famine in Bethlehem has subsided. It's no longer, so they decide they're going to go home. At that point, Orpah decides she's going to stay in Moab, their country, and then, but at that point, Ruth pledges her allegiance to Naomi and to the Lord at the same time. There, Ruth meets Boaz as she happens to wander across the field, and they learn that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer of hers in the lineage of that. And Boaz finds favor in Ruth and takes favor in her and gives her a lot more than is necessary. Naomi devises a plan at that point to help Ruth get in front of Boaz and ask her to marry him. Ruth follows that plan, we learned last week, and meets Boaz on the threshing floor and asks him to marry her. He then takes the initiative there and accepts that request, but tells her that there is a redeemer close to her that he has to go through the right chain of command, or chain of order, before he is able to redeem her. Now they're in a waiting game. So at the end of the class of the lesson, they've been asked to. Boaz told her to wait, and he'll have it done by the end of the day. He'll have the matter settled by the end of the day, and that's where we left off. So, scene 4. We've had 3 scenes so far. This is the last scene that we have in this book. Scene 4 is where Boaz arranges redemption at the gate, is what I've got a title here. So, can I get a volunteer to read Ruth chapter 4, 1 through 6? Ruth 4, 1 through 6. Thanks, sir.
Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Then went Boaz up to the gate, and sat him down there. And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by upon unto whom he said, Oh, such a one, turn aside, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city, and said, Sit ye down here. And they sat down. And he said unto the kinsman, Naomi, that is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise, disclose it unto thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants, them that sit here, and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. Then said Boaz, What day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar my own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So, see in the beginning that they go to the gate. What is the gate? What is this gate that they speak of?
The gate.
What's that?
The city
The
gate,
city gate, and what took place at the gate?
their courthouse.
Yeah, it's kind of like a courthouse, like we would see in kind of some of the older towns where you have a courthouse in the middle of town. That's where the gate, so a lot of the, it's like a town hall or a courthouse, you know, where business took place, different things of that nature. Let's turn over to 2 Samuel, chapter 15 and verse 2. And we'll see several examples here of this taking place. 2 Samuel 15 and verse 2. Can I get it? I'll follow it. 2 Samuel 15 verse 2. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. And when any man had dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, From what city are you? And when he said, Your servant is of such and such a tribe in Israel, Absalom would say to him, See, your claims are good and right, but there is no man designated by the king to hear you. So there's an example of things happening at the gate. Let's turn over to Proverbs 22. In verse 22. Do not rob the poor, because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. And in Amos 5 and verse 10, Amos 5 and verse 10, he tells us, They hate him who reproves in the gate, and they abhor him who speaks the truth. So, this just gives us an idea of what takes place at the gate. It's a place of concourse, business, and justice was taking place. So, on next is, so who were the elders that it talks about here? Who were the elders? Who were the elders?
The leaders of the city.
What's that?
The leaders of the
They're
city.
the leaders of the city, right? So let's turn over to Deuteronomy 25 and verse 7. Deuteronomy 25 and verse 7. Tells us there, And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. And then let's turn over to 21 and verse 19. Back with you. So chapter 21 and verse 19 tells us, Then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city and the gate of the place where he lives. And the last example I here is 22 in verse 15. 22 and 15 tells us, Then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. Okay, so these elders witnessed these different transactions and they decided different cases that came to them. Almost like judges. So every city was governed by these different elders that were appointed. Any comments on that? So, why 10? So, what was the significance of the number 10? It tells us that there were 10. You grabbed 10 elders. What was the significance of that?
Some say that you had to have, in latter times, you had to have 10 men in a community to establish a synagogue. So therefore, this was some kind of type of majority that they looked at in their customs.
Yeah, I don't think we have it. That is definitely, that's modern day practice, right? The modern day Jewish religion would say to be able to have synagogue, you have to have at least 10 present for it to be a lawful synagogue. It may have concluded at this point that was the purpose for having 10, to be able to be consistent, to have the 10 elders in place, to have a lawful public assembly. Okay, so we've got those in place. So why was Naomi selling the land? It says here that she was selling the land?
It was probably the only asset that she had since she had left probably most of her belongings and.
Yeah, a couple different things that, like, right, we've talked a lot about the situation that her and Ruth are in at this point. That may have been the only, value that she had to be able to, create some sort of means to be able to take care of it.
Also, one of the purposes of the Redeemer was to take the land. She had no heirs, so there were no male heirs left in their line to take ownership of the land. So it was to keep it within the family, so it was to pass to one of the Redeemers so that it kept in the family and their inheritance continued.
Yeah, so this is exactly what we were talking about last week with property redemption, right? So this is kind of the thought behind that premise of her selling that land to the Redeemer, to the one who's the Redeemer. So we aren't told at any point what happened to the land after Elimelech, right? Once they left, we don't know what happened. So we don't know if at that point they sold it off. I mean, they could have at that point sold it off for the means at that point because they were in a tough spot at that time. Before they left, we don't know at this point if she potentially possesses it. But once she came back, that wasn't anything. It was hers to put forward to redeem to whoever that individual was. So either way, no matter which direction that went, it was a kinsman but had to redeem to be able to do that.
This scene at the gate was like a hearing that we normally refer to, where Boaz states the premises upon which he is selling the land and which Naomi is selling the land. And so at that hearing, it's the time when, like, you have the same kind of discussion and decision-making that happens on the cities of refuge. The elders at the gates of the city decide whether it's manslaughter or murder. In this particular case, on the transaction of land, it's a hearing for anyone to come and protest. Oh, we own the land. We have an interest in it. And so Boaz, in a manner that is open and clear, states his case that if anybody's going to take issue with it, now is the time to stand up. But he wants an open hearing. He wants it known before everybody, his purposes and Naomi's purposes. And so it's actually one of the things that's handed down from to our generation through the English common law, picking up on things like this, that things are adjudicated, decided on the basis of fairness and openness.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because you think about how much we can take that into our own character, right? In business dealings, whatever it may be that we do, is that you take that into account of always, being upfront. He had no hidden agenda here. He made it very clear that this land was available, and if he didn't want it, that he wanted it. That was everybody that was there knew of what the agenda was and the reason for bringing it forward.
His agenda was to do the right thing
For her, and what was in place for the people.
It's a hearing of the people.
Of the people. Yeah. Perfect. All right, so we go in forward here. So he talks to the Redeemer, brings it forward. The Redeemer's like, okay, I'll take it. Then he tells them about Ruth. So why does the Redeemer, the first Redeemer, change his mind? Because he first said he would redeem it. I'll take it. Why does he change his mind?
Ruth's hand is tied to the land. If they want the land, it's Ruth's inheritance too, because it was her husband's
Because it
land.
was her husband, right? So he would be part of this redemption, or she would be part of this redemption as well.
I think there's two reasons. One is that she's a Moabite.
That makes very
I think that is an issue. I think the second or equal reason is that he realizes that what's going to happen here is that whatever descendant he produces will not be his, but will be really back to the Naomi and Ruth, and therefore he will not receive the benefits of the land. So now I've got two families that I've got to raise basically off of the land that I own, and this other land over here, I'm not going to get the benefits of it, and therefore I've got double the cost to take care of this lady and her daughter Ruth, or daughter-in-law Ruth.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the basis of the real problem.
Bill and Chris said, yeah, so I think you're right. I think there's several things that are kind of going through his mind here. We talked about the Leverett law or the Leverett marriage before, about how he had to take that on. Now, there's some commentaries that I brought forward that, as you're talking about, brought forward this thought that his own name would then be blotted out at that point, right? So by taking on this, and I don't know, to me, the goal, is that, I believe that's how you pronounce the name, but if you take on this role of the goal, that your own name would then be blotted out, because that, as you said, that inheritance would go back to Elimelech. It would not be his. So on top of that, we don't know his stature, meaning his means, but to take on, that would be like taking on essentially two families. I'm now taking on Ruth. I'm also taking on Naomi financially. So not only did he have to buy back this property that was available, he also then had to take on the responsibility to be able to take care of Naomi and Ruth, and then any children also that would come along with that. Yeah.
We don't know all the details, but it seems to me there's a striking contrast between Boaz, who wants to do what's right, because I didn't see, I mean, you read the scripture earlier about the man perpetuating his brother's lineage. I didn't see an out clause in that. I mean, it would have fallen upon, because the passage you read earlier said if he won't do it, you bring him before the elders of the city gate, and then basically...
They basically said his name.
Yeah, his name is now, mud in our term. But what a contrast between Boaz, who is, I think, going to do what's right, and a closer relative who says, no, I can't really get involved in this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because if you think about his thought process, he says, oh, I'll take it. At first he says, I'll take it. And then he talks to him about having to take Ruth on, and then having to take, she's Moabite, all these different things come forward. And then, maybe I'll back up, and I think you see a little bit of selfishness here on his part of, I don't know if I want to take this on. This may be more than I want to take on.
It was inconvenient.
It was inconvenient, yeah.
And I'd like to kind of add to that this perspective of Ruth as a hardworking person. So we hear that, and that seems to be, in my view, one of the things that might have impressed Boaz about her first, because he asked, "What sort of woman is this? Who is this?" And the worker's like, "She's been out here working, only taking a short break." So you get the land, which has, I would assume, some kind of profitability. And Boaz knows that Ruth is a hard worker. So it's possible, too, that he knows with God, with his ability to help someone grow and develop, with his ability to manage land, and with a hardworking individual, his house is only going to be blessed. This other individual, I don't know, like Scott said, we don't have the details, but he may not have had that outlook. He may have seen anyone who comes to him as a liability versus an asset. He may not have been confident in his ability to grow and develop an individual.
Yeah.
So, we may have those aspects too. And with God, we have this growth mindset because that's what he wants us to do. And that kind of carries on to others. But without God, it's possible that there's a fixed mindset or a liability.
Yeah, you're looking at bottom line, right? You're looking at your bottom line rather than actually the overall picture of. And we've seen that in Boaz's character throughout this whole time. As
The study guide in my Bible made an interesting point. It said that this man that's going to be the initial redeemer refused to do it for self-serving reasons. Didn't want to interfere with his inheritance that was already lined up. But as it turned out, had he have gone ahead and redeemed Ruth, or Naomi and Ruth, he would have been in the lineage of our Savior. Whereas after this, we never hear of him again. His self-serving interest did not serve him very well.
Yeah. The alternative of what he wanted to happen essentially happened, right? He was concerned about his name, and then his name essentially gets erased, showing that he obviously had no control over that.
Talking about names being erased, it's very interesting. We know who Mahlon is, but we don't really think about Mahlon. We know who Boaz is because he's in the lineage of Christ. But look at the other guy. Soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. Boaz called him by name and said, "Come over here." We never see his name.
Yeah.
It's not in here. He's not named.
Yeah.
And he never will be.
That's kind of
His
interesting.
name
too,
is lost.
because this whole thing kind of came about like, he didn't make his name. He didn't. It's almost like, and then was able to pull 10 men together to be able to do all this. So it almost was happening. You could see God's hand in play throughout this whole thing. That all of that was able to take place.
I'd like to offer just a little bit of a different perspective. Boaz knew this man. He knew what his obligations were and so forth like this. He knew what he needed to do. And he knew that when this man found out that there was Ruth and Naomi involved in it, he knew that he was in line. He had no wife. He had no family. And the man he talked to knew that too. And he when he said that this will ruin my inheritance, he may have had a family. He didn't want to disrupt that. But he said, you can be the Redeemer. So he knew that Boaz, so I'm not seeing it completely as negative on the first Redeemer. Because Boaz knew. He went through this, he knew that Ruth would be with him. And that this is the way I see it.
Well, and I can see that. I can see that point. Yeah, I can see that point. Well, somebody else, I was talking with someone else about this. I mean, you would assume that Bethlehem was a fairly small town, so everybody knew. You would assume everybody knew everybody. They knew her whenever she came back in to Bethlehem. They knew who she was. So you would assume that he probably knew already about this.
The whole city was talking
about it. So, I mean, a lot of this was going on. And then to your point, he says, lest I impair my own inheritance. So, which could tell you that he has a family, has children that he's already taken care of, that he has an inheritance that's going to pass down to, and then, it's point well made. Okay, so we bring all this about. So what about Boaz's inheritance? And Boaz's name?
It's in the lineage of Christ.
But he didn't know that, right? At this time, he had no idea. Had no idea at this point. And what's going to happen to his name once he takes on this, role as a redeemer?
Always remembered.
What's that?
He will always be remembered.
Be remembered because of the kindness that he showed, right? Some of the notes that I put about is we know he's a wealthy man, right? We talks about that in our book, and him essentially knowing that he has this and willing to openly take on this responsibility, embodies his character of sacrifice. We can go through a list of different things of him taking on this role, but overly, like we talked about before, embodying those characteristics of Christ, and essentially losing his name for the sake of Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion to become that redeemer. Okay, so let's move. All right, let's move forward. Let's go Ruth 4, chapter 4, 7 through 12. Can I get somebody to read that?
Well, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. And Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman."
Okay. Why does the author take the time to explain this custom at this time? We talked a little bit about this in the beginning when we talked about this book.
I think we're seeing the play of Christ in the actions of Boaz. The idea of assuming a responsibility for the obligations on this particular transaction. He didn't have to do it. It wasn't something that was an obligation to him until he took it upon himself to do it. Jesus did not have to die. Jesus came, and he certainly, when you look at the episode of the scenes of Christ going to the cross in the weeks before his death, he was troubled in spirit. And all that was upon him was an understanding of the obligation that he was taking upon himself. Boaz is extending himself, demonstrating the measure of the kind of man, character, and individual that he was, and the kind of attitude he had about being like he had been called. Jesus is acting because he understands the character of the Heavenly Father. He understands what a gift is. He understands the kind of compassion that is necessary to assume the debt that we owe, that he has decided to pay. I think that's the illustration of why this book is here, like so many others in the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think somebody once told me that if you don't see Christ in every page of the Old Testament, you're not looking very hard. And to this point, so whenever we discuss about these customs, I think there's also a time.
One of the guys that I read said that what this was saying was that, first of all, he believed that Samuel wrote the book. And what he's saying is by the time Saul came along, they wrote everything down because it's more legal. Whereas this was the custom about 100 years before, that this is how they handled the transitions of passing of land or any other, what we would consider civil matter.
Yeah, that's it, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to, is, there was that gap. There's a gap between the writing, and this, remember, this is during the time of Judges, when people kind of did whatever they wanted to, what was right in their own eyes. So I think the customs that were in play before might not have been followed by everybody. So this was, I think that's probably why the author kind of put this in place, because at that time when it was written, that may not have been the custom. People may not have done this, have been doing this. So the letter of the law was most likely not followed real close. Okay, so you kind of alluded to this. So what does that sandal represent then? As a symbol, what does it represent?
Just taking off the responsibility and handing it off to someone else.
Just handing it over. So it's that transfer of of being the redeemer, right? You now, you had it. Now I'm physically, it's a physical symbol of I'm now passing that on to you. That is now passed from me to you. And I put a few verses here. We won't turn to it just because of time, but there's just some other examples of this taking place. Okay. So Boaz then. So Boaz, I'm going to go back. Boaz proclaims his right to redeem the property. The property, Naomi and Ruth, in front of the elders and the people in the city, and that he would marry Ruth, and that he would carry on the name of the dead, so that it wouldn't be cut off of him. So from that standpoint, then it goes to, it makes a reference to Rachel and Leah. What did Ruth have in common with those two women at this point?
Well, they weren't actually Jews, were they? I mean, they were from another country. So that they have in common. And then the point of many children as what they had. They were, basically it's our way of throwing work. Back in the old days, we threw rice at people after they got married. That was a custom to hopefully infer that you would have children.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at this point was, Ruth was obviously had been married to Balaam, but had not had any children. And, so her womb had not been opened up at this point, and you could see God's hand as he's moving through this, putting this in place. So he moves forward and talks about act worthily. We've talked about this in, I think, every class that we've done about this word, worthy. Why do you see this continue throughout this book? Why do we see this continually play out throughout this book? So he said it in chapter 2 and verse 1 about Boaz. Said it in 3 and 11 with Ruth. There's obviously got to be some reason why it's here.
Well, they need to know the play that they were involved in, that God wanted us to know the character of each individual, that they were worthy to be ancestors of Christ.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot on his plate, right? God had a lot in store for him, and her, for that matter. There's a lot in store for the both of them going forward. And it would stamp that type of characteristic on their family, right? Their character was going to embody. Boaz was taking on somebody else, taking on Elimelech's name here, essentially by redeeming them. would, you know, embody their family name as well. So then he goes on and talks about, you know, the ESV says renowned in Bethlehem, but I also put famous in Bethlehem. What are we talking about here? He says renowned in Bethlehem or famous in Bethlehem. What do we know about that?
These are ancestors of King David.
King David, right? They're ancestors of King David, which then leads to what?
To Christ.
What else comes? Obviously, we know this. What comes out of Bethlehem? Jim already hit on it a little bit earlier. Jesus comes out of Bethlehem, right? So there's some significance here. Kyle was talking about earlier. We don't see Christ in the Old Testament. I mean, it's right there in front of us. All right, so let's push into chapter 4, and I'll read 13 through 17. Chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, so we remember the comment we made about Rachel and Leah just a while ago. So we start to see this put in play, and I'm going to put forward. So Obed, the meaning of this name, serving, service of love and duty, servant of God. What type of how do you think Naomi felt at this point? I'm going to turn it back on. How do you think Naomi felt? Ignore that last question. How do you think Naomi felt at this point?
Grateful.
Very grateful. I don't think she obviously I don't think was expecting. I mean, obviously she had a plan in place, helped Ruth through this process, but I think setting her back some time from where she came. I mean, she's got to be extremely grateful.
Scott, he was honored.
Honored. Yeah, I think that's great. I think
Exactly.
Joyful.
joyful, honored, joyful.
I was going to say this is quite a contrast from where she was at the end of chapter 1, because she says, Call me Mara, because the Lord has dealt with me bitterly. And I think one of the things, too, you know, we've been reading the Psalms through this year, but this book here reflects so many times the sentiment of many of the Psalms about how we were downcast, or we see everything seems to be going against us, yet the Lord saved us. Or in some of them, it said the Lord's our refuge, or the Lord's our Redeemer. Anyway, maybe we all have that attitude. We're all going to go through difficult times, that we hang on and see what's going to happen.
And I think it also shows that God hears our cries, right? God hears our cries that are.
How is a Moabite appropriate in the lineage of Christ?
Well, I mean, there's several other instances. That's one of my questions you're going to see here. There's two other foreigners that are in the lineage of Christ as well, with Tamar and Rahab. So you're going to, I mean, I think that's, when I get to my key points and takeaways, you'll see that. I think that's some of the, I think that's the beauty of this book, and the beauty of some of it is that God can work through anyone. It doesn't matter. He doesn't have, he doesn't have preference over race, ethnicity. I mean, you can take this into several different, through several different avenues, but I think that there's a point to that. There's a reason that God utilized that, not only in this book, but throughout the lineage of Christ. this essentially brought her back from where she was at. God has now restored life. He's answered her cry to this point. He started.
Keegan.
Yeah.
Just
Sorry.
to add on to that to the answer to that last question about Ruth being a Moabite and the lineage of Christ, to add on to what Peggy said, it was also their actions. Anyone that you see that was not an Israelite in the lineage of Christ, it was because they chose to follow God. So it was their actions and their faith. And so, along with Peggy's point, that's more important than their ethnicity. Yes.
Yeah, it was their actions that took place that
I would just confirm that with Romans 9 and the 30th verse, where Paul is talking about the Jews and the Gentiles, and he says, "What shall we say then? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law." The point Paul makes is, when the Gentiles did things like this, they made themselves subject to the law of righteousness by faith. And God gave them and gives them here the benefits of that, and it was always on his mind to reconcile the Gentiles to all men.
Yeah, faith and obedience, right? They showed that.
God had a plan from before time, and these are just the pieces falling into place of the plan that he had in place before mankind.
Yeah, you made that comment on the first class, and you could see, anytime you see the famine come into the book, you see God's hand usually start to take a role in that, and we saw that throughout this entire book. So, the significance of number 7 is just completeness or fullness. That's just kind of the. All right, I'll read this real fast. So now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. So we can see here, and we went through this the other day. We can see through the lineage here in Ruth that it gives us that link all the way through from David, and then obviously we know that David